Hello, this is Scott, and welcome back to the channel. Today we want to talk about LXD Container Web Management. Brian's awesome open source YouTube channel focuses on installation and configuration of open source applications, which he configures in Docker frequently. Brian's featured Portainer many times, which is a web-based management interface for Docker. Docker containers feature application virtualization. On my channel, I have a two-part series on LXD container VLANs and a review of Docker versus LXD. LXD containers feature operating system virtualization. So, in review, in my LXD tutorials, we showed how the LXC command line can be used on a QNAP NAS in lieu of Container Station to manage LXD containers. The LXC CLI manages LXD containers, which are much more lightweight and efficient than virtual machines. Virtual machines virtualize the hardware and the operating system, and the OS must be installed and boot up is slow. LXD containers do not have an installation and are pretty much instant on access to the operating system. So, Portainer is a web interface that manages Docker containers only. Proxmox is a bare metal operating system to manage LXD and LXC containers and also virtual machines, but it needs to be installed on a dedicated system. LXD Mosaic is a web-based interface that can manage LXD containers offered from multiple hosts. So we're going to create a LXD Mosaic instance in a LXD container on a QNAP NAS and show how it is more functional than Container Station for managing LXD containers. However, this information is applicable to managing LXD containers on any host running a LXD server and does not require a QNAP NAS. So how do I start? Well, you're going to either need a QNAP NAS running Container Station or just an Ubuntu instance with LXD configured. LXD can be installed in Ubuntu with the simple command sudo apt install LXD. You're going to add a user to the LXD group for easy management so you don't have to have privilege, and that would be sudo user mod and add my user, if that's the name of your user, to the LXD group. And then you're going to set up and configure LXD with the sudo LXD init command. So initializing your Ubuntu bare metal or VM with LXD's out of scope, and that init command is covered in some of my other videos, and there's also lots of great information online. So we're going to learn how to create a LXD container connected to your untagged VLAN to host LXD Mosaic. In my previous videos, we talked about how to connect to a tagged VLAN. So both Docker and LXD create containers on a private NAT by default. In previous LXD tutorials, we showed how to create a LXD container on those tagged VLANs, as I mentioned. So we're going to create a LXD container on your untagged VLAN, and the assumption is that you're on a QNAP NAS with Container Station installed, which means LXD is configured, or that you're on a machine with LXD installed already. So our LXD Mosaic management interface is actually going to be a LXD container, and it's really a web interface is what it is. So the steps to do that are: you find the interface for your untagged VLAN, you add a LXD profile to point to the untagged VLAN, you launch an Ubuntu 2004 Focal Fossa container to host LXD Mosaic. You connect to a Bash shell prompt on the new container. You download the LXD Mosaic script. We're going to make the script executable. And then we're going to run the script to install LXD Mosaic. And finally, we're going to configure the product through the web interface, and we'll briefly go through some of the commands. Okay, so here we are at a terminal, and I'm going to SSH into one of my NASes, and I'm going to quit to the shell environment, and I now have a shell prompt. I'm going to do an IP route show. And you can see here, these are all of my interfaces. I have a lot of interfaces on my QNAP NAS because, first of all, it has 4 NIC interfaces on the back of it. And then secondarily, I also have some VLANs defined. But this interface right here, that's denoted as QVS1, is actually my untagged VLAN. And one of the ways that I can tell that is because it has an address on the untagged VLAN, which is the 172.16. I could also use this QVS0 interface above, but this one works fine for what I want to do. Okay, so the first step, that now that I've done the IP route show and I see that my device is called QVS1 that I'm going to connect to, I'm going to go ahead and create a LXC profile called untagged. So I do a LXC profile create untagged. And then I can say configure that profile with a LXC profile device add untagged Ethernet 0, which is the name of the interface within a LXD container. And then I have a NIC type equals MAC VLAN, parent equals QVS1. So what that does is that is the command to connect to an untagged VLAN. If I do the command LXC profile show untagged, we can see that untagged profile. And that's what it looks like. So now that I've got that set up, I'm going to go ahead and create a container with a command that doesn't fit on the screen very well, but I will go ahead and show it on an overlay. It's creating the container, downloading the container, unpacking the container, and executing the container. Okay, so now I have an Ubuntu container. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to open a Bash shell on that container, and now I'm in the container itself. So now that I'm in the container, I am going to download the LXD Mosaic script with this curl command. By the way, I'll put all the commands in the show notes. Now we have the script for the installation of Mosaic downloaded. And now I'm going to set that script to be executable because that's a requirement. So I use a chmod to set it to executable. And now I'm going to run the script. And there we are, /install LXD Mosaic. So this is going to run for a little while. Okay, and now with the magic of video, we are at the end of the installation. You'll notice here that it highlights the address that your web server for LXD Mosaic is running at. And in this case, this is an address on my untagged VLAN. So now what we want to do is we want to exit the shell. And then it's going to be important to do a lexc config set core.https underbar address to left bracket colon right bracket. And that is in order to be able to provide access to the LXD server that is running on the QNAP or running on your Ubuntu machine. And then what we want to do is we want to do a lexc config set core.trust password, and we're going to enter some type of a password. And I've already done that prior to this, so I'm all set. At this point in time, if we go back to the container station, you can see that there is a LXD node that's running right here. And my advice is the address for this thing, which we saw was 172.16.1.107 in my particular case, is a DHCP address. I recommend you set that to a DHCP address reservation, so that way you will be able to get to it every time between reboots, and it won't change addresses on you. So anyway, I hit advanced on my web browser and I say proceed to this address. And then it wants me to put in the address of my NAS that I want to manage. And you can actually add more than one host here, but in this particular case, it's just the address of whatever's running LXD. It could be your desktop machine, whatever it is. And we've entered those lexc, the last two lexc config commands you saw. So this right here is the password for that host that we entered in. And so I'm typing that. And then you can put an alias in here. In this case, I'm going to put an alias in for VMS Fog. And the reason I'm going to use that is that's the name of that particular NAS. And then over here for users, you go ahead and for the admin, you can add other user accounts, but for the admin, then you want to enter a password. And I'm entering a password for that. And then you should be able to say launch LXD Mosaic. Then you get a username prompt. At that point, since I left it at admin, I'm typing in my admin, I'm typing in my password, and I'm clicking sign in. And this is the interface that you get. So you can see on the left margin that VMS Fog, the alias we put in here, is listed. If I click on VMS Fog, you can see that VMS Fog has the container LXD Mosaic and also NetBoot XYZ. So let's go back to the QNAP here, and you can see NetBoot XYZ is a LXD container, and LXD Mosaic is a LXD container. We're not seeing any of the LXC containers, but those are going to be obsoleted before the end of the year or maybe slightly past the end of the year by QNAP. And so we want all of our new containers to be LXD containers, and that's what LXD Mosaic manages. So at this point in time, we can look at a lot of different things. We can certainly click over here and close up that or open that entry there, and you can see LXD Mosaic over here, and you can see NetBoot XYZ. And I can actually click on the little Ubuntu logo, and it will give me instance details. So I can see that it's running Ubuntu 2004 because that's what we built the container with. And I can see the network information. In my case, it was assigned a IPv4 and an IPv6 address. Matter of fact, if we go back to the terminal prompt and we do a lexc list, you will see that NetBoot XYZ is out here, and it's running on an internal network, 10.0 network. But when we put the LXD Mosaic on the untagged VLAN, there it is. And since the untagged VLAN also supports IPv6, there's the IPv6 address. So that's really fantastic. So now you can see memory usage and you can see other sorts of things. You can see that there's two profiles here that are used to build this container, default and untagged. And then you can take snapshots of the container and you can set limits. So here we are at the main dashboard for LXD Mosaic. And here you can see that LXD Mosaic and boot netboot-xyz is running here on this particular LXD node, which is VMSFog. Now let's see what it takes to create a new container. Well, I go up here to create a container. And I'm going to go ahead and give my container a name of test-lexd-tutorial. And then the profiles I'm going to want are, first of all, default. I start by typing DEF. And I'm going to want the untagged profile also, so I can have this on the untagged VLAN. And then my only host right now is VMSFog, so I'm going to start typing VMS, and there I create this thing on VMSFog. And then I want this thing to be an Ubuntu container, and I'm going to go ahead and create a Focal container. So I'll click the first one. And then I'm going to have some optional settings that I'm going to need to configure. And first of all, I'm going to say boot-autostart or boot.autostart is going to be set to true. We want the container to automatically start when LXD starts. The next one that I'm going to put in here is, let's see. We have to do security.privileged, and we have to set it equal to true. Because on a QNAP NAS container station, if you start a LXD container and you haven't set the privilege for to be a privileged container, it will not start for whatever reason. And then I'm going to go down here and I am going to say set limits.memory to 2048. Now let's make it 4096 megabytes. And then I'm going to look for limits.cpu allowance. And I'm going to say you can have up to 15% of the host CPU. So there you go. I'm going to say create and start. It's going to think for a while. And with some luck, we're going to end up with a container running here. And hopefully it'll update here in a second and you'll be able to see that the new container is running. Now, here it is over here, so that's interesting. All right, so there you go. We have a test-lexd-tutorial. Now let's look at that from the container station side. Here's the container station side, and there you can see that I have test-lexd-tutorial. If we go into it and we say settings, you can see it's set to auto start. You can see that it has 4096 megabytes of memory like I configured and up to 15% of the CPU. And if we go into advanced and you go into device, you can see that it has run containers in privilege mode, and that's what the switch is that says security.privileged equals true. And then the network shows up blank. The reason is because the LXD in container station is somewhat limited, as we talked about in my previous videos. So going back to the LXD interface, there you go. You have your machine. So you can actually look at that particular machine, see its resources and what it's doing. You can see that it has the default and untagged profile. you can see that it has 15% of the CPU and up to 4096 megabytes of memory that it can use. And you can see what its address of this particular machine is. Again, it got it via DHCP. If you wanted to get the same address every time, go to your network and create a DHCP address reservation. But for now, it's 172.16.1.211 because that's my untagged VLAN. And then you can see that it has a link local address for IPv6, and it has an IPv6 global address also. And then it has a Anycast address, which is what you expect through IPv6. And then you can also click on the console. And by default, it'll enter the BOSH shell. I can say go. And I can do things like, I don't know, apt install net-tools. Just like any other console. So instead of SSHing into it, I can do this here. I can clear off this console. I can do an ifconfig from that command. And there you can see the network settings. Could also do something like an apt install neofetch. Okay, now that neofetch is installed, we're going to do a neofetch command. And there you go. So it's reporting that the uptime is 3 days and 50 minutes. That's the uptime of the host itself, not the uptime of the container. It's calling out the kernel as Linux kernel 5.10.60, and it has a suffix of QNAP, just to let you know I'm running on a QNAP. And the OS for this particular container is 20.04.3 LTS. And it says it actually reports the total amount of memory on the NAS, but we have memory limits on the container that says that it can only use 4096 megabytes. And then the host machine actually is an AMD Ryzen 7, and it will report through to that. Remember that a LXD kernel or a LXD container actually uses the kernel of the host operating system. Okay, so now we can go back to details, and by clicking details here, again, we can see all the details. We also have backups. We can schedule backups for this container. And we can also look at files, and it will show you files in any particular part of the container itself, and you can go navigate to those. And then you can also turn on metrics for these things. So for example, if we came back here to the top level, we can enable metrics on any of these containers, and it will gather metrics if you want, and then it'll be able to display those. So that's pretty neat. The other thing we have is the ability to add other container hosts besides VMS-Fog. And I'm not going to do that in this video, but it's pretty intuitive. You can add other container hosts. And so you can have LXD containers on one host, on another host, and so on down the line. Now, to delete a container, you can simply bring up that particular container. And so we're in LXD, we're in test LXD tutorial. If we go back to Container Station, you can see in the overview that we have test LXD tutorial. If we go back to LXD Mosaic and we click on the trash can, it will not do anything initially because it's going to require you to stop it. So we stop the instance. Now over here it tells us the instance is stopping. Now that the instance is stopped, I can delete the instance, and it says, are you sure you want to delete this instance? Well, we won't delete it yet. We'll go back to VMS-Fog, and we can say, see that the gray block here indicates that instance is stopped. If we go back to LXD Mosaic and say delete this instance, it'll go ahead and delete the instance. It should go away here in a minute. with any luck. Go back on the VMS Fog side. It is gone there. So on the Mosaic side, probably need to click on VMS Fog and then click away and click back, and it goes away. It looks like the web interface for right now doesn't update. But this thing, LexD Mosaic, is in constant development. Matter of fact, I noticed that the last 7 days that it had received a new version. Anyway, this is a really nice addition to managing LexD containers, and it has a lot of other features. It's way more functional than what you have through Container Station, and it's nice to sometimes have a GUI way to look at things overall via a web instance, as opposed to having to do everything from a LXC command line. So, in summary, we learned how to install LexD Mosaic to provide a web interface to manage LexD containers. LexD Mosaic is to LexD containers what Portainer is to Docker containers, meaning a web interface. And LexD Mosaic can manage containers on multiple LexD servers, just like Portainer can manage multiple Docker servers. And LexD has powerful features not found in QNAP Container Station, and it's easier to use than the LexC command line. So LexD containers are my first choice for self-hosting because they're lightweight operating system instances that can be easily modified, and they can be upgraded, unlike Docker containers, which basically have to be replaced. Anyway, thanks for stopping by today, and please subscribe and like to the channel, and we'll see you next time.